Let me introduce today's speakers. We have two amazing women that are going to speak about different arguments, different points of view, historical, political, and sociological aspects that can lead us in a more comprehensive understanding of Asia. The conference will last two speakers, but all of you is kindly invited to enrich the debate, writing your questions in the chat. We very would like to engage a conversation with you, but everybody knows the situation. So please, if you have a thought or something you would like and to share with us, do not hesitate to write in the chat. The first speaker is Netusha Naidu, who is participating from Malaysia. And she has graduated in international relations from the University of Nottingham and is currently pursuing a Master of Philosophy in World History at the University of Cambridge. She is involved in many projects about the geographic area of Southeast Asia and is co-founder of Imagine Malaysia, a non-profit education project that aims to broaden the understanding of the specific region. Her skills and knowledge in fields as world history, decolonization will provide us more important tools to better understand the connection among decolonization, the state building process, and remaking politics in Southeast Asia. The second speaker is Francesca Rosati, graduated from the University Chengchi of Taiwan and PhD candidate at Leiden University. She has been conducting many studies in China, in particular in southern Gansu. Moreover, she wrote a book named Islam in China, and she's going to underline the role of religious minorities in China, but also the role of Muslim women within Chinese society in the more complex picture of the national government and its economic and political perspectives. But I don't want to spoil too much, then I will say that we may start. So, Ms. Naidu, the floor is yours.
Hello, hi everyone. It's such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Hikmah team, for inviting me to speak at your at this event and series that you have going on. Well, this is the first time I've done an overseas talk or guest invitation from another university, so it's a huge honor. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's get to my presentation. I'm going to share my screen and then we can get started. Okay, let me just I'm quite new to Zoom, so apologies everyone if like I seem a bit blur, but okay. It should be coming soon. Just give me a minute. No, not like that. Okay, wait, sorry.
Okay, I think we have some connection problem and we are going to resolve soon. Okay.
Hello?
Okay, Netusha, can you hear us?
Oh no, oh no, oh no. Okay. Okay, all right.
We can see your presentation.
Okay, this is very weird. Why is this happening now? Hello.
Hello, can you hear us?
Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, the floor is yours. You can start whenever you're ready. We cannot hear you anymore. Okay, there are some problems, of course. Okay, we're going to resolve it soon. Yes, it makes sense. We can start with Francesca if she is ready to speak. Okay, your microphone is off. It's turned off, Francesca.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry about the connections problems. Thank you for having me here today and for the wonderful introduction, Elisa. Okay, today I'm going to introduce the topic of the role of women along the within the Belt and Road Initiative, which was a strategy, a project launched in 2013 by Xi Jinping, which aims at connecting China to the Eurasian region. So I will start by talking about minorities that mostly live in Xinjiang and Gansu. I have chosen these two provinces. I don't know if you can follow up my my presentation, slide 2. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, Francesca, we are.
Yes.
Okay, second slide, perfect.
I think the Muslim minorities who live in Gansu and Xinjiang are most relevant because they're actually cultural majorities in these regions, and also because of the geographic position of these two provinces. They represent the segment, China segment, that is the gateway to Central Asia and further to Europe within the OBOR strategy. As I said, these two groups constitute the majorities or cultural majorities of these two regions. In Xinjiang, the Uyghur amount to almost the 40–50% of the overall population. Xinjiang was annexed to China in the late 18th century during the Qing dynasty, and it was officially proclaimed a province in the late 19th century, but interethnic tensions has been going on, we can say, since then, and are still not resolved, as we shall see. As for, I think we can move to slide 2. As for, let's just stay in slide 2. In Gansu, the Hui population is scattered throughout the province, and mainly in the region around Lanzhou. I did my fieldwork in 2006 up to 2017 in this region, and particularly in Ningxia city, which is known to be, which is known also as China's Little Mecca. And the local population there constitute the amount to the 51% of the overall population. I would like to step forward to slide 3. Sorry, I forgot to mute my phone. Just give me a second. Yes, as I said, these two provinces are strategic in the sense that the belt, the so-called belt, the land road that stretches from Beijing to Europe, passes through Gansu and Xinjiang via Lanzhou and Urumqi. So when Xi Jinping launched this project, it aimed at the modernization of the region, which was not new within China's strategy, the modernization of this region was a key point, a focal point of Jiang Zemin politics when he launched the Xibutai Kaifa, the Great West Development Project in 1999. But one major difference between Jiang Zemin project and Xi Jinping project is that Xi Jinping feels the urge to sort of pacificate the ethnic conflicts in the region in order to bring to improve Chinese national security and as well as its role on the global arena. So I think we can move forward with the slides. As I said, among the countries who partake in this project, the Belt and Road Initiative, hereafter the OBOR, about 27 are Muslim majority countries. And so in order to improve Chinese diplomatic and economic, strengthen China's diplomatic and economic ties with this country, China is putting forward a twofold narrative. One that depicts China as an harmonious, multi-ethnic and multi-religious society where Muslims live at peace with other minorities, which of course is rather controversial. And another one, which is addressed at this country as a reliable country, politically stable, and which has a portion of Chinese diaspora, which is actually Muslim. So what China has been trying to do since the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative is to also to co-opt the minorities, the Chinese Muslim diaspora in key countries such as, for instance, Saudi Arabia, which hosts about between 150,000, 180,000 Chinese people. Most of them are Muslim. These figures are date back to 2010, so they're not completely accurate, let's just say. So China is trying to co-opt these minorities, overseas minorities, to promote this new image of the country, but this project is not always, this strategy is not always succeeding because of because China is facing mounting criticism regarding its treatment of minorities within its borders. Just to give you a glimpse of the situation of Islam in China, I think we can move forward with the other following slides. Just to give you an idea, Islam, it's a religion that has been practiced in China, some say since the 8th century, and is, as you can see, is in the yellow parts of the map, indicates the diffusion of Islam in China. When we talk about Islam in China, we have to bear in mind that we are talking about the so-called ethnic Muslim, that is the minorities that issued from that has been classified as Muslim minorities, which amount to 10 out of 55 ethnic groups in China, according to a project, a classification project known as the Minzu Shibie, the ethnic classification that has been launched in 1953 during the Maoist era. According to this classification project, there are 10 Muslim minorities, but of course Islam it's also practiced by non-Muslim, which are not who are not censed, and so we cannot have figures, we cannot have a glimpse of the real impact of this religion in contemporary China. So I think we can move on to the, okay. as regarding what kind of Islam are we talking about? The majority of Muslims in China practice Hanafi Sufism. I'm sorry, I think the slide is a little messy. Anyway, so you can see there are several groups practicing Hanafi Sufism. And then, namely the Gadimo, the Menhuan, which refers to the Sufi orders, and Ikhwani and Salafia, which are the most recent indigenous movements. I'm talking about indigenous movements alongside with Shidaotang, which is a Islamo-Confucian kind of teaching in China. Aside from these movements, there is a new a new strain of Islamic proselytism, which is, by the way, theoretically illegal in China, which is brought forward by the Tablighi Jamia, an Islamic proselytizing movement was been founded in the 20s, and it's as an offshoot of the Deobandi movement, which is a movement that originated in the city of Deobandi in southern India. So basically, the Tablighi Jamia started as late as the 80s and is scattered throughout the country and proselytize. As for the Shia Islam, as you know, Islam has two, let's just say, great two main confessions, so to speak, Sunnism and Shiism. Shiism is practiced by the Tajik minority who lives in Xinjiang, which amounts to a few thousand of people, and also by the contemporary enclaves of Pakistani, Shia Pakistani, Iranian people, Iraqi, and so on, who work in the commercial cities of Guangzhou and Yiwu. So as you see, Islam is really an heterogeneous reality in China, and again, it's we should refrain from generalizing when addressing this topic. I think we can move to the next slide. As I said, there are 10 ethnic groups, and the Huizu and Uyghur, are the most numerous. The main difference between these two groups, the two main differences, the Huizu are often addressed as the Chinese-speaking Muslims, and they are scattered throughout the country, whereas the Uyghurs tend to concentrate mostly in Xinjiang, and they are Turcophone minority. We can move on. This is just a few pictures I took when I was in Linxia, just to give you a glimpse. Of course, again, we should refrain from stereotyping, but one main feature of of Hui identity is the so-called white hat, and which, as you can see, is quite fashionable among youngsters, and both youngsters and elderly. Okay, we can move on. Another main difference between Hui and Uyghur is that Uyghur are the majority of Muslim diaspora from China abroad, both in the West and in Muslim majority countries. These two people, Dolko Nisa and Rabia Kadir, are the two main figures, are two leaders. One is the actual president, and one is the former president of the World Uyghur Congress, which is one of the most powerful and influential organization of the Uyghur diaspora abroad, and mainly in the West. There is just to give you a glimpse of how the Chinese try to have an impact on as I said, the Auburn narrative is that one that depicts a peaceful society, a peaceful and multi-ethnic society, and one that wants to promote China economic strength without interfering in other countries' politics or interethnic conflicts. But in fact, what we can see is that China is trying to set different economic agreements also with foreign countries and with Muslim majority countries, also to in order to be able to have an impact on local diaspora communities. Just to give you a glimpse, in 2017, Dolko Nissa was invited by the Italian parliament to give a speech, and he was arrested before entering the Senate, although he's a German citizen. And that was because back then the head of the Interpol, the International European Police, was Meng Hongwei, which is a Chinese citizen. So China is trying to influencing the Muslim diaspora discourse and political activity abroad, as well as within its borders. A thing that I would like to point out, usually Uyghurs are described as pro-Salafist minorities in China, and therefore terrorists, especially after September 11. The Chinese government has enlisted a team, which is the Eastern Turkestani Party, founded in 1997, among the terrorist organization that operates worldwide, and which is allowing the party to use it a little bit as an excuse to hinder local Islamic practice in Xinjiang. But in fact, Islam in Xinjiang is, there is a Salafist exist, but they represent a minority. Most of Uyghur practice sort of popular Islam, which is deeply influenced by Naqshbandi and other Sufi mystical movements. Remember, Xinjiang is directly connected to Central Asia, so Islam in Central Asia is deeply influenced by Sufis, and so is Islam in Xinjiang. I think we can move on with the next slide. Thank you, Elisa. A turning point in Chinese policies towards its Muslim minority has been marked by the 19th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, which was convened in Beijing in October 2017. That was the year when I left my fieldwork, and I was in Asia studying, I'm writing a thesis about female madrasas, women's madrasas in among Hui majority Muslim societies. And back then I could feel as a direct impact on my fieldwork how the censorship was operating in preparation right before, 2 weeks before the Chinese Communist Congress, known as the Shijiuda. There are a few main points that are, besides reinforcing Xi Jinping position within the party, there are a few political steps that China has been putting forward since the Shijiuda. One is the so-called Chinafication. Some translate this with Sinification, but I don't subscribe on this because I think terminology, because I think it creates confusion. Sinification is a cultural process that took centuries and of course tended to bring peripheral people to the acculturation to mainly Confucian culture and what is perceived as being professed by the Han majority Chinese people. But Chinafication, conversely, is a political project that aims at reducing foreign influences on Chinese people, and namely Western influence on Christians and Middle Eastern influence on Muslim minorities. This translates into different policies, towards Uyghur and Hui. Up to 2017, the party enacted policies that were much more repressive towards Uyghur compared to the Hui, in the name of the war against extremism, separatism, and terrorism. So, for instance, I'm not a specialist on Xinjiang, I forgot to mention, but I have Uyghur friends, and I was, when I did my last fieldwork in Malaysia and also in Italy, I witnessed how this policy operates. For instance, if a person in Xinjiang download a WhatsApp or answer a WhatsApp call, this could cause him to be arrested and put in the so-called re-education camps. Again, here I think there is a problem of terminology. We have to be careful. China is facing a mounting criticism over its treatment of mistreatment of Uyghur, but I think we should not talk about genocide unless we add the word cultural before it, cultural genocide or cultural erase, because Uyghur people have been imprisoned, tortured, exploited, but not killed. So I think this makes a big difference. When I was in the field in Ningxia, Prime Minister Li Keqiang made a speech including Ningxia among the regions more sensitive to in terms of extremism and terrorism, Islamic extremism and terrorism. So that marked a shift in the party policies as well, and mainly the party since then has been enacting the so-called war against the 3 trends and 2 fevers. So anything that is related to exposure to Middle Eastern culture, such as the Arabization or the Saudization in particular. Although Saudi Arabia is one of the main oil supplier, it's China's main oil supplier, and both parties have agreed in abide by a non-interference policy regarding their own internal conflicts. China is very much worried about the influence of the travels to Mecca from the Hajj, the pilgrimage, or study trips in Saudi Arabia might have on Chinese in back home. So just to give you a glimpse of the role of Chinification, we can go. Can switch to the next slide. This is the Lauqua Mosque, a very famous mosque that is home to the a very famous mosque in Ningxia. Let's not go into the details. This is how the mosque looked in 2006, 2017. You can see the difference from Chinese traditional feature towards more the so-called Arab, or this is hard to, it's in 2006 the mosque underwent a complete restyling, which required an enormous amount of fundings, and when a friend was visiting Ningxia in 2020, he sent me the picture, as you can see. Now the mosque has been restyled again, we can see, and is probably being turned into something that look a lot more like a Chinese traditional temple. This is another aspect of the Chinification policies, that is a return to the traditional Islam. Because what China doesn't want to assimilate Muslim minorities, but wants to promote the idea of a Chinese Islam. So in this regard, Sufi groups are more easy in this process, because they've been there for a long time, and they also their shrines feature resemble more to let's say reflect more the traditional feature of Chinese architecture, whereas the movement, the teachings I was talking about, Ikhwani and Salafi, they have a a more global approach to Islam, and they tend to espouse the patterns of what the party perceived to be a progressive Arabization. So I think we can move on with the next slide. I choose to address the topic of the veil, although veil in Islam, Islamic veiling has been the main topic of several researchers and very famous Muslim feminist scholars and Western scholars had already addressed this topic across transnational societies. And but why do I want to talk about the veil? First of all, because I think that there are very few studies who address the topic of the veil and in general of Muslim women religious practice in China. And second of all, because I wanted to take us outside of our comfort zone, since the veil, it's a controversial topic in our society. For instance, let's think about the veil ban that has been adopted in France after the 2011, or the more recent veil ban in Swiss. So I think we can move on to the next slide. I'm not, as I said, I'm not an expert of Xinjiang, so I mainly rely to secondary sources. This is just, in fact, just to give you a glimpse of the situation in Xinjiang, and to point out that the veil, as Islam, cannot be generalized. It's a practice that means different things according to different women. As you can see here, you have different Uyghur women who features different veiling fashion. And for instance, this scarf around the hair and the brown cloth that covers this old, quite aged woman head, those are more indigenous way of veiling. That are targeted by the party as being especially the veil, the brown cloth, which is a very local practice in Kashgar, so the extreme northwestern part of Xinjiang, is addressed by the party rhetoric as an example of Islamic veiling, which does not belong to traditional Chinese Islam. Whereas the doppa, the head that you can see on the left side of the slide, it's a traditional head covering, typical of, it's a female garment, but men also wear it. And this is considered more acceptable. As for the other forms of veiling, they reflect the exposure of Xinjiang local cultures to Islam starting from the 80s. As you know, during the Cultural Revolution between the 60s and the 70s, mosques were closed down and any religious activity was forbidden. So back with in the at the end of the Cultural Revolution, during Deng Xiaoping opening up reform, throughout the 90s, there was a major exposure of both Xinjiang and Gansu to the Muslim world through pilgrimage, to travel study trips, and also through the cyberspace, the internet, the television. So there was a major exposure of the different niqab styles from Pakistan and Malaysia, which became very fashionable in both Xinjiang and Gansu. In other parts of China, Muslim women do not necessarily tend to veil. Again, as I said earlier, veiling means different things to different women, so it changes according to whether the woman comes from a rural area or an urban milieu. It changes according to age and career agendas. Of course, if a woman works in in a government office, she's forbidden to wear a veil. But if she studies in a school, the veil will represent a sign of her learning process as a Muslim persona. We can move to the next slide just to give you a full glimpse of a few pictures I took in Linxia. As you can see, veiling in Linxia is slightly different from veiling in Xinjiang, highlighting, testifying to different local traditions. Nowadays, the party is targeting the niqab style, which covered the face, and which is mostly adopted by women who were more exposed to the Salafi teaching tenets, whereas the niqab is very much, the hijab, sorry, is worn by women, generally women who works in school, and also women who rediscovered their faith, or maybe they got married. Not all women in Gansu wear a veil, but older women tend to wear this black veil, which is called gaito. And in the center of the slide, you see a woman sitting on a bed, and she's wearing total black. And in this case, her way of veiling has nothing to do with the affiliation to an Islamic movement in particular, but it's just, as she told me, a way of expressing her faith, and her also way of telling people that she's undergoing a learning process. Her name is Sena. I met her in 2006. She was 49 by then, and she managed, after her son got married, so she acquired a daughter-in-law who could take care of the house domestic chores. She was finally able to go back to school and learn Arabic, the basics of the language, of course, and nonetheless, she managed to become a teacher and to teach other women. And that appeals her on both levels, as a Muslim woman living in a secular society, who was able to found her faith again, and also as an aged woman, because when you are in your 50s in China, in Gansu, you are considered old. And she was worried about the afterlife, which is a main concern about Muslim women I encountered during my fieldwork. They often pointed out, how could I face Allah the day of my death if I wasn't a good Muslim? So for them to undergo a learning process, it's appeasing on two levels, this world and the hereafter, in the hereafter. A woman I met in Malaysia, she came from a Muslim milieu, but when she was young, she told me she couldn't care less about veiling or practicing Islam. But only when she underwent a learning process in a madrasa, she became more aware, and she decided to resettle to Malaysia to further her studies and to become, she told me, an advocate of women's rights. She said, I do not consider myself a feminist, which is a controversial term in China since Maoist era, because it's perceived as being the reflection of a Western bourgeois influence, capitalist influence. But I want to become an advocate for women's rights all over the world, and I want to do it through my veil and through my Islamic practice. For other women who wear the mauzi, that is the pink hat that you see over there, this is also a form of veiling and a female garment, which is very traditional in the Gansu area, but can be found also in Ningxia and Qinghai provinces, both not in the northwest of China. But for these women, the veil is not necessarily a symbol of their faith or of their modesty, but maybe just a cultural feature of their that better express their ethnic identity. And that is particularly true for women in Xinjiang, who stress their ethnic identities as Uyghur more than as Muslim, given their constant pressure from the Han majority. The party has been enacting what is known as the ethnic drowning, that is the massive displacement of Han people in order to counterbalance the Uyghur Muslim presence in Xinjiang. And this is another facet of Islamic Chinification and party policies in Xinjiang. You may have heard of the so-called re-education camps, which are unfortunately a disastrous phenomenon. But by giving you these examples, I wanted to point out that religious repression and censorship occurs on different levels in China, and it does not necessarily translate into immediate violent actions. Of course, one of the measures adopted in these re-education camps, especially targeting women, is that of educating them, training them to become a hairdresser. That is to work with hair, and to convince them that to cover, it's pointless to cover your hair. Instead, you should make yourself beautiful. And this, I would like to show you the next slide, a tweet that has been tweeted by a government representative, a Chinese government representative in Pakistan, who caused embarrassment for China. He posted this tweet, who was erased soon afterwards, pointing out that Uyghur women should unveil themselves rather than veil themselves. So as you can see, once again, as feminist scholars have often pointed out, women's body becomes the place of contentions, the arena of contentions among different discourses. And although women are a minority within a minority in terms of repression, because we don't hear much about them, actually, one of the reasons why is that the government policies against religious fervor they are not gender oriented. They see, and this is a sort of a matrix that can be traced back to a Marxist vision a Marxist interpretation of class struggles, one that highlights class struggles over gender struggles, over gender inequalities. So the party put forward this narrative of gender equality. Women should be able to enjoy the same rights of men, and they see the veil mainly as a symbol of repression, not as a symbol of tradition, ethnic identity, or religious modesty. Next slide, please. So to sum up, does Chinese Muslim women religious practice comply with China's latest global economic agenda? I would say yes and no, in the sense that, of course, when I decided to address the topic of the veil, I followed up what anthropologist Levitt addressed as cultural remittances. In a book published in 2017, Levitt points out that the remittances are not only economic, but they're also cultural. There can be transmissions of ideas, practice from the host country to the home country. And Muslim women exposure to the Muslim world starting from the 80s is an example, in my opinion, of this circulation of remittances of practice that has been adopted by Chinese Muslim in the diaspora first, and then they got back to China when they return home, or through video calls, or through the internet. But China's latest clampdown on religious practice in China is engendering what I called remittances interrupted, in the sense that it undermines the religious practice at its very core, and specifically it's trying to undermine the circulation of ideas and practice related to Islam between mainland China and the Muslim world. And so that's my presentation. If you have any questions, or you would like to have some bibliography, please do not hesitate to contact me privately. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you so much. I think it's very interesting how the issue of the veil is an hot potato, not just for European and Western countries in general, but also in Asia. And also the censorship, the strong of the censorship can reach also Western countries in some ways. So thank you so much. I will say that we can keep the questions for the hand, so we can filter them. And there are a lot of questions in the chat. Please still writing in the chat. Now I would like to leave the floor to Netusha. We'll try to put on your presentation. I hope everybody can see it. And so Netusha, the floor is yours now.
Hello, first of all, I'd like to apologize about just now. So I'm actually outside my house with hotspot so that I have signal. I live in Malaysia, not in the capital, Kuala Lumpur. So this is the problem with living outside the capital. Okay, so thanks everyone. And thank you so much, Francesca. That was a beautiful presentation and really important topic. So really appreciate that. Okay, so everyone, as Elisa mentioned just now, I specialize in Southeast Asia. My whole discipline, I'm just like Southeast Asian full through and through. And right now my interest is actually in southern Thailand, but I still have a general interest in how political history and intellectual history in general, the history of ideas in Southeast Asia is understudied, especially in the context of decolonization. So my presentation today, titled Decolonization and World Making, Rethinking Politics in Southeast Asia, draws upon my dissertation work, the analytical work that I've done in the context of southern Thailand, but I'm going to extrapolate to what's happening today in Southeast Asia. It's a very crazy time in Southeast Asia if you've been following the news. So can't wait to just dive right in right now. Okay, so first off, we are experiencing this crazy tide of decolonization. It's global, okay? Decolonization has started to gain political currency in the world's former imperial metropoles in the recent years. It manifested in calls to abolish police brutality, revise whitewashed curriculums, or tapping statues of slave owners. Across continents, universities, museums, student organizations, indigenous and ethnic minority movements continue to interrogate the foundational structures of the worlds they inhabit, despite facing scorn and ridicule from critics for what has been framed as culture wars by the woke left. Whereas in Southeast Asia, decolonization does not necessarily garner the same kind of enthusiasm that it may appear in other parts of the world. In fact, the first time I ever came across decolonization in very practical ways of politics was when I went to Cambridge to study my master's. Otherwise, decolonization does not really envision in everyday politics from where I come from. Fueled by the uncertainties precipitated by the COVID-19 pandemic, Southeast Asia has witnessed a repeated assault on its democracies. Schools and universities in the Philippines now face the prospect of limitless surveillance, with police and armed military presence as a result of the unilateral repeal of the University of the Philippines and the Philippine Department of National Defense Accord on Academic Freedom. In Thailand, pro-democracy protests remain steadfast in demanding reforms of its monarchy. The Tatmadaw regime in Myanmar has staged a coup and continued to use extreme military measures to silence its dissenters. Malaysia, where I come from, is in a state of emergency that comes after its unprecedented political crisis last year and has granted unbridled, illegitimate authority to an unmandated regime led by Malay supremacists. Inaction towards human rights violations, rising religious fundamentalism, and unsatisfactory measures to contain the pandemic have also crippled Indonesia's democratic ethos. So, what does a term like decolonization mean to a region like Southeast Asia today? Notwithstanding the political carnage born out of institutions and their legacies of empire, the term means and its requirements have remained contested worldwide for over a century. At the end of the Second World War, colonial administrators in Europe had begun to view decolonization as an inevitable process that would safeguard imperial economic and political interests in the colonies. As political theorist Adam Getachew argues, the granting of independence would be fashioned in the European gaze, compromising of what she calls processes of unequal international integration that were increasingly racialized in the late 19th and 20th centuries. However, anti-colonial nationalists had been galvanized into demanding sovereignty and made attempts to deny European imaginings of nation in their societies. The Japanese conquest between 1941 and 1945 mobilized Southeast Asia's peoples, promoting quasi-militaristic values that had further legitimized the use of violence to expedite independence and resolve conflicts over national authority and identity. As more countries in Southeast Asia gained independence, cultural decolonization became more critical. Together with European political and economic domination in the region, indigenous systems of knowledge and tradition were subject to the scrutiny of Orientalist scholars who framed Southeast Asians as backward and uncivilized through racialized terms. Consequently, post-colonial Southeast Asian states were rendered as a people without history, paving the way for nationalist elites valorizing post-Enlightenment ideals and paternalistic attitudes. The struggle against this has been especially central in countries like Cambodia, in which the displacement of indigenous cultures and traditions by the Khmer Rouge and the 1965 anti-communist purges in Indonesia were extremely traumatic. While the Anglophone world emerged as the central site of Black internationalism in particular by the end of World War II, anti-colonial world-making was not limited to the central characters of the Black Atlantic. Broader political formations, such as the Bandung Conference and the Non-Aligned Movement, since 1955, also advanced the project of constituting a post-imperial world order. Organized around the rubrics of Afro-Asian solidarity and the Third World, these formations played a central role in securing a right to self-determination and envisioning a new international economic order. The African-American thinker W.E.B. Du Bois argued for the links between modes of racial domination in post-emancipation societies with a new era of imperial expansion in the late 19th century. During the first Pan-African Congress, he famously said, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Whether explicitly or implicitly, a new generation of anti-colonial nationalists in Southeast Asia too had extended Du Bois' critique of the global color line in their own ways. Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand where reckoning with the persistence of illicit trade for Southeast Asian heritage has gripped national politics, reignited calls to consider object restitution and its integral role in evolving narratives of national identity. Students and activists are protesting against Singapore's discriminatory laws and policies against the LGBTQ+ community, citing an increasingly homophobic society's colonial origins. Environmentalists, labor unions, and workers continue to protest the omnibus law on job creation in Indonesia, fearing further degradation of living standards and climate change. Under the banners of exclusion and minoritization inside former colonial states' borders, antagonism towards these tragedies, particularly the crimes against Rohingyas in Myanmar and Patani Malays in southern Thailand, hardly transcend national identities beyond our own. As a result, the limitations of Southeast Asians to imagine transnational, trans-ethnic solidarity come to the fore. Now, partly riding on the global reverberations that movements like Black Lives Matter, Milk Tea Alliance, and the People's Party 2020 calls to re-examine racial, nation-bound thinking matter to Southeast Asians more than ever. Colonialism, critics insist, did not just shape regions that have culminated into the global South. It has made the modern world as we know it. As sociologist Syed Hussein Alatas has written, colonial capitalism has diminished the potential of self-determination in Southeast Asian societies. Profits from extractive trade fueled the rise of port cities like London and Amsterdam, while Southeast Asia's economy, that slavery and indentured labor, created amassed and obscene wealth in the metropoles. Political scientists and bureaucrats of Southeast Asia prefer to describe the festering presence of tyranny in Southeast Asian autocracies as fragile, hybrid, and competitive authoritarian. Very oxymoronic, but yes, this is the vocabulary of political science and Southeast Asian studies, because they uphold the profound continuity of the post-imperial world order. However, in every moment of opposing state authorities, protesters are forcing renewed national narratives and a confrontation with empire. It is an appeal for decolonization in every sense of the word. The illusion of the empire on which the sun never sets is finally eroding. Banging pots and pans in the streets of Yangon to mark the return of evil, or young women uploading TikToks alleging sex scandals involving Indonesian politicians, direct action function as interstices that are tearing apart the fractures and frictions between our past and the present. By insisting that the past remains in our present, these protests have unmasked the economic achievements and political stability of nations as the product of colonial exploitation and racialized despotism. This historical reckoning is merely the beginning for Southeast Asia, acknowledging that our colonial past has shaped present-day inequalities and hierarchies that make up the world structures, sets the stage for the next one, radical reimagination and world-making. Reparation is owed to Rohingyas as much as it is to other ethnic minorities subjected to state-endorsed discrimination and violence. It would mean treating all migrants and refugees of the colonized world as equal participants in Southeast Asian society. Moreover, this is a form of reparation that cannot be achieved overnight in a single conversation. Instead, it must be predicated upon renewed commitments to an inclusive and egalitarian Southeast Asia. But today, The poverty of imagination, when we think about nations without wrangling its colonial legacy, has limited our ability to collectively overcome the legal and material injustices of an unequal post-imperial world. The culmination of this failure is the association of Southeast Asian nations, otherwise known as ASEAN's, willful inaction to end the Rohingya genocide. Consequently, these historical processes allow us to imagine nations through Cold War bipolarity and suggest that reimagination and world-making remains in the realm of possibility for Southeast Asian nations. How the end of this renewed pursuit for self-determination and decolonization in Southeast Asia would look like is one that cannot be quickly ascertained. As Priyamvada Gopal wrote in her thought-provoking book, Insurgent Empire, inhabitants of the post-colonial universe ought to conceptualize ourselves as agents when facing oppression from the racialized post-imperial world order today. There is no option but to push back, fostering that critical oppositional spirit and keeping it alive is the ultimate and ongoing work of decolonization. Just as Tuck and Young had famously written, decolonization brings out the reparation of indigenous life and land. It is not a metaphor for the other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. To reimagine Southeast Asia is not an easy feat. However, we should remember that just 80 years ago, empire appeared as the most stable and permanent feature of the international order. But in the past 3 decades, anti-colonial nationalists and atrocities had transformed ideas of humanity and the world. The struggle for racial, political, and economic justice in Southeast Asia is a fight for a genuinely post-colonial condition, and its establishment is implied in each protest against authoritarian ambitions in Southeast Asia. If colonialism made the modern world, then decolonization will not be complete until the world, including Southeast Asia, is reimagined. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Netusha. It was amazing. I think the most important thing is that you can provide us a vision outside European-centric vision. You know, you're from Malaysia, you studied a lot about this. Decolonization is something that everybody knows, but not really knows a lot about it. So thank you so much. It was really impressive. I think we can go on with the questions. Okay. I think this is for Francesca. Francesco is asking, are there any Chinese media that talk about discrimination against Muslims? And in general, is the Chinese public opinion aware of what the government is doing against these minorities? So Francesca, if you want to answer.
Thank you, Francesco, for your question. As far as I know, I think Chinese media are trying to counterbalance what they perceive to be as Western propaganda against China. Let's not forget that under the Trump administration, Republican Party members have addressed the issue of Uyghur persecution and re-education camps. So China felt attacked in this regard, among others. And so, for instance, a video of the 2 nieces of Rabia Kadir, which is one of which is the former president of the World Uyghur Congress based in the States, have been released by Chinese media. And these 2 girls, beautiful girls, unveiled, of course, were taking a long walk along the streets of Urumqi in malls with Gucci and, you know, Cartier, etc. And they were pointing out that, in fact, what their aunt is, the bad publicity she's making against China, when in fact they were enjoying great freedom of visibility and mobility in Chinese society. They were able to benefit from scholarship from the government to further their studies. So I think the Chinese media try to counterattack, and these videos are, of course, delivered on social media for everybody to be watched, but I think they are mostly intended for a local audience. The second segment of your question, I would say that there is public opinion in the public opinion in China is mostly dominated by Han netizens, and there is a new wave of violent racism towards Muslim minorities by these netizens. So there is, when I was in Linsha doing my fieldwork, I had the chance to meet a few Han converts to Islam, and both of them told me that before converting to Islam, they didn't like Muslims. They thought they were dirty. And maybe even within the Muslim community, sometimes you have the Hui discriminating against the Uyghur, which are perceived to be less acculturated to Chinese culture. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, for sure. I will ask now a question for Netusha. Okay, Hannah is asking, sorry if you already told and I did not understand, but what were the recent protests about in Malaysia, and is militarization an issue in political process? What about the society awareness of politics? So Netusha, if you want to answer.
Hello, Anna. Thanks for that wonderful question. So this is the more embarrassing part of being a Malaysian. There have been no protests. That's the worst part. The whole of Southeast Asia, every country, everyone is on the street despite COVID-19, right? And then in Malaysia, we just, people have not been going out on the streets. And so what has happened is that Malaysia has been ruled by the same political party since independence, known as the United Malay National Organization, called UMNO. Okay, it's a three-party coalition based on race, and this was the ruling government that Malaysia has known since like forever. And 2 years ago, after great, there's a lot of financial scandals, corruption, and issues that brought about a lot of instability in Malaysia. And which is what political scientists describe as Malaysia as being a competitive authoritarian state where you have elections like Singapore, but then it's always the end game is the same. Same coalition would always win, right? But something changed 2 years ago as a result of the former Prime Minister's corruption scandal, Najib Razak, and the 1MDB issue. An overwhelming amount of Malaysians had managed to vote in the opposition, known as Pakatan Harapan, to be the ruling government. However, 2 years later, after this somewhat center-left, progressive and very liberal democratic regime took over, a coup actually happened, and basically UMNO was back in power with a kind of like similar party called Perikatan Nasional that became the ruling government and is currently managing the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet how distraught people are about the fact that their vote was and mandate of the previous government was not fulfilled. People are still not out in the street. And militarization, well, the thing is, like, because in Malaysia, and I think it's a consequence of like repressing communist politics since the 1940s, that militarization never became an issue. But of course, lately with the managing of the COVID-19 pandemic, we do see a lot of strengthening and militarization, not just militarization, but the police force is also given a lot more power. And quite, a lot of this power is kind of abused. So we have a lot of issues, but we don't have the language to articulate the way you know, when I went overseas there, like in the UK, I learned about police abolitionism and things like that, right? But the kind of vocabulary is non-existent in Malaysia. So it's very underrated. I think that ties to another question, but I'll let Elisa bring it up later. And in terms of societal awareness of politics, oh yes, I think generally people are very aware of politics and take a huge interest. There is this misconception that rural Malay people, which are a good majority that are quite marginalized, do not have an interest in political issues. It's also a very misguided notion in the context of studying Malaysian politics. Actually, because I did a lot of fieldwork in rural parts of the rural part of Malaysia, one of the most popular states for political scientists to explore called Kelantan. And I conducted fieldwork there for my research on southern Thailand. This is because most people have moved to Kelantan to flee the Thai government. And also because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I could not travel to Patani and meet people. But I did meet a lot of people in Kelantan. Pretty much it's the same thing. So, but what I learned there is that the layers of awareness are different because in terms of political opportunities and interest, but generally, yeah, but it's just that the vocabulary on change and agency is not there. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Netusha. Now another question for Francesca. Hannah is asking, which book by Levitt published in 2017 did you mention? And then there is another question for you, and it is, are younger generations preserving these cultural and religious traditions, and how are they dealing with the Chinese government?
Okay. Okay, so the book was published, in 2001. I was wrong, and it's Levitt. It's spelled Levit. Can you repeat double T? Sorry. Can you repeat the other question, please?
Yes, I think that
Elisa.
you have some. Yes, I think you have some connection problem, and we didn't understand the name of the book.
Okay, the name of the book published in 2001 and one was the Transnational Villagers.
Okay, maybe you can write it in the chat for anyone. So I can go on to the other one.
Yeah.
And the question is by Hannah Gay, and it is, are younger generations preserving this cultural and religious tradition, and how are they dealing with the Chinese government?
When she talks about younger generations, she referred to younger Muslim generations or younger generation in general?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is about younger generation of Muslim.
Okay. Well, of course, just let me write, okay, cultural. I cannot give an overall, I cannot provide an overall picture because, of course, this should be subject of research, and there are different Muslim societies in China. Muslim societies from inner China are very different from those we can find in Gansu, and even rural and urban milieus are also are very different. I can give you a glimpse by talking about the situation in Ningxia, which is, as I said, is also known as China's Little Mecca, and which means that people from outer province, from other parts of China, go there to study because there is a high concentration of mosques and, of course, of madaris. So people go there to study, used to go there to study. Now the schools have been shut down, unfortunately. According to my field findings, teachers from these madaris were complaining about the fact that youngsters are not no longer attracted by religious education, which is understandable given the fact that they cannot commodify it, in the sense that they cannot, after graduating from a madrasa, they cannot access the university, because they won't have madrasas in China. With very few exceptions, do not provide official state-recognized diploma. They operate outside of the state system. So younger generation of Muslims in Linxia, they are more attracted by university studies. They want to have a career in government offices, which means better salaries and better working prospects. I am sure that in Xinjiang, people are subjected to a more deeper control, in the sense that the party is trying to carry out the cultural erase in a deeper way. The schools are forbidden to teach the Uyghur language. So, and also I think what consumerism is, as the video featuring the two nieces of Rabia Kadir was partly showing, China is promoting this idea of a consumer, a class of consumer, what the party addressed as the Xiaokang Shehui, the well-off society. What they aim, and this is also part of their Chinafication process and project, is to widen the range of the middle class. They want a country of consumers. Consumerism, it's a leverage, and also a powerful tool to erase differences in terms of cultural identity and affiliation.
Thank you, Francesca. Of course, it's not an easy situation. It's quite complicated. We can go on with some questions for Netusha. Then we have to finish. Also, because in Malaysia is night, I think.
It's okay. It's if you want to take a little bit more time, I'm okay with it too.
Yeah. Okay. For Netusha, from Luna, she's asking, today, many Westerns are moving to Southeast Asian countries, bringing along many Western cultural features, international schools, restaurants, Western way of life, etc. Do you believe that we can talk about a new form of colonialism? So, Netusha.
I saw that question earlier in the chat, and thanks, Luna. It's, I have to admit it's a little bit triggering for me, because I've been recently serving as in the capacity of head of department in a private boarding school in Malaysia. And so international schools, I know all about it. My mother is a teacher as well in an international school. And, we spend a lot of time talking about colonialism, and colonial nostalgia being constantly reproduced in states like Malaysia. And it's very unique phenomena in the context of just Southeast Asia, because if you go to Indonesia, or you go to Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, these are countries which have had very strong anti-colonial movements, right? So you would not see the same kind of reproduction of colonial aesthetics or colonial sensibilities about education or anything, you see. So in the context of, to answer your question, that's why I think it's different. Malaysia is kind of like slightly like an exception in the context of new forms of colonialism. But another thing we should take into account, which ties back, and I would love to hear Francesca's response, because like listening to your presentation about Xinjiang and the issue of Xinjiang, right? What came to my mind was also how we look at Thailand in the context of Patani Malays, right? And Tamara Luz, historian of Thailand, wrote about how Thailand, the Thai kingdom or the Siamese kingdom at that point, and until today kind of reproduces its own logics of European colonial modernity, right, in governing spaces that they seem that they cannot tame. So one of the spaces that they're not able to tame is southern Thailand, a peripheral border state. It's very ambiguous, right? And Xinjiang as well is this very ambiguous part, overlaps with the Muslim world and the Sinophone world, and you've got these things. And the thing is, what we think about this new form of colonialism, it's not just about focusing on whiteness and how whiteness pervades foundations of institutions or governments and everyday life and politics, right? But also how colonialism or the logics of colonial modernity are appropriated and applied very differently in different contexts. It's the same with Myanmar. I think Hikmah had Maung Zauni earlier previously to talk about the sensibilities of colonial modernity in the context of Myanmar under the junta, right? So we know that it's different, same but different, as how Malaysians like to say. But yeah, in terms of casual importation, yeah, Malaysia, yeah, it's embarrassing. We always do that, especially in international schools.
I think in Xinjiang, what is going on since the communist is what scholars such as Etcher in 1975 and Gladney in 1991 are calling internal colonialism. So, and as I said, the ethnic drowning is one of the measures to enact this internal colonialism, the massive displacement of Han people. And if we use a sort of metaphor, the farther you are from the center, which is the farther you are from what is the self-perception of the Han majority as the most civilized ethnic group in China, the more barbarian you are. And since its inception, the story of Xinjiang, which by the way means new frontier, and it's a name that is not utilized by Uyghur themselves. They call it East Turkestan. It's a logic of colonialism, really. And since its inception, the Uyghur have been perceived as more barbarian, even more barbarian than the Hui, for instance, who have been addressed as the Chinese-speaking Muslims, which could sounds like a neutral denomination, but in fact it entails the meaning that they are closer, they're more acculturated to the Han culture. Okay, I think the problem is that we should investigate what does it mean to be a Han. What is Han? Is there a Han majority? Of course, those are labels, and that they're being created for a strategy, so to allow the dominant group to dominate.
Yeah, that's just like, sorry, Alisa, do you mind if I just jump in and reply to that? That's just amazing, right? You see, because we see, because the thing is, we have all these divisions in our area because of, again, colonial logic, American imperialism. You have area studies, right? East Asian studies, Southeast Asian studies, and this Cold War bipolarity. But what we learn then from these examples is, borders and how it perpetuates its own logic, and then sometimes that communities and more like historical memory or trauma affects the way they rearticulate. And then the point of Hanness versus Uyghurness, right, fitting together. It's a similar issue in Thailand as well, where you've got Thainess always being constantly pitted against Malay Muslim identity, right? And this constant conflict. And that feeds into what I term, the phrase I use in my thesis is the specter of separatism, where in order for separatism to seem like a real threat to the existence of a nation state, in this case like China, or in my context Thailand, then there is a need to constantly show that this minority identity is a threat to a larger majoritarian identity, whether it's Hanness or Thainess, right? And then we have the, as a result, then we show that separatism or separatist movement become real rather than imagined threats, and it gives a monopoly of violence to the nation state then to act and perform its colonial modernity, which is crazy.
Thank you.
Yes, I just would like, sorry, I just would like to point out that even the Uyghur self-perception has been guided in the last decades by these interethnic conflicts, because there was no such thing as Uyghurs before the 1920s. That was just a way of describing a bunch of people joining an international meeting in Tashkent that they didn't know how to address, so they came up with this term Uyghur. But in fact, it's much more complicated. Xinjiang was made up by Asian identities, which were scattered throughout the region, and they did not constitute a uniform group. But in fact, the way Uyghur perceive themselves now stems much from this interethnic conflict and from this repression the party is putting them under. So we cannot deny, even though they did not exist before the 20s as such, as they do exist now, and they perceive themselves as Uyghur.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your conversation and your debate, because I think it's fundamental when the speakers interact among themselves. So we are running out of the time. So Netusha, there is a question for you from Celeste, and she's asking, have Western liberal principles influenced civil rights movements in Malaysia more than decolonization values? At what extent are they relevant within the current society?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. That is exactly the problem you see in terms of like decolonial thinking, and a kind of historical reckoning is not there in political imaginary. Civil society organizations in Malaysia are generally quite liberal. And in the sense, what I mean is more center right rather than center left or like extreme left. So very dominant groups still fall within logics of institutional reforms and whatnot, but through very liberal lenses. This also has to do something with the political economy, obviously. A lot of Malaysian civil society organizations are funded by institutions like Open Society, what is the American one, Development Aid, USAID, yes, USAID and whatnot, right? So this could be one part of it, but the other part of it is just generally the kind of sensibilities. Decolonization, anti-colonial thinking does not resonate in the literature, okay, and like in general human rights discourse. A lot of it comes from the fact that because human rights discourse is in the context of Malaysia has not been indigenized or been interrogated effectively enough. So and that's why for me it's like, as someone who thinks about this and wants to extend conversations of decolonial theory in the context of Southeast Asia, it's becoming more and more relevant. Seems like a good time to do this research as well, while Southeast Asia is going through this reckoning. So so I think that it's not relevant enough, but I think a new generation of movements and more globalized youth are thinking along the lens of decolonization. Very good example is the Multi Alliance. It's a very interesting side of practice of decolonial praxis. It's very left, obviously, and you see that it's not as popular in Malaysia as it is in other Southeast Asian countries and with East Asia. But this fostering of transnational, transregional solidarities is an important experimentation that shows that we are going towards the direction of making it more relevant. So I hope that answers your question. Mm-hmm.
Yes, of course, totally. I have a last question, is for me, and it is about feminism. I would like to ask you, to both of you, what do you think about the form of feminism which is present in Malaysia and in China, and if it's present in, what is the tendency, the trend? I mean, there are analogies and different or also criticisms to the Western vision of feminism. For example, Francesca said before about the bourgeois vision of feminism. So I would like to ask first to Francesca and then to Netusha. Francesca, you have your microphone turned off.
I'm still not very used to Zoom. I'm not an expert on feminism debates in China, but I can tell you that there was a period in the history of feminism in China, and namely during the May 4th movement in 1919, where Western ideas were flowing into China, and so where there were many modern thinkers that ideas about women and the liberation of women from Western thinkers, even though we saw that in colonial settings, in Western colonial settings, our ideas of gender equality were not always respected. But so during this, when Mao took over, so starting from the 50s, there was a rejection of all Western, and there was a pro-Russian inclination. So feminism, it's also a matter of terminology. I'm sorry, I don't know how many of you speak Chinese, but feminism in Chinese is called 女性主义, which is womenism. So this 女性主义, this terminology was completely rejected as the sign of a early Republican exposure to Western ideas, which was considered a sort of colonialism by the West. And instead, the party preferred to talk about 解放, liberation. But I don't think the party had a vision, as I said, at a Marxist vision. So everything was measured in terms of a class struggle, and women had to join a class struggle. So in general, Marxist analysis is not, the early Marxism is not very much concerned. What I mean is that the one that comes through to China through Russia, so especially influenced by the thought of Lenin, was not very much concerned about gender roles in society. It is true that women who were affiliates to the Communist Party and who went to work in the rural areas, they wanted to use this notion of, and again, I'm sorry, I have to speak Chinese, 良妻贤母, of the virtuous wife and devout mother, which is very deep rooted in the Chinese thought, and it was also reinforced by the Japanese influence on China during the early imperial times, so at the beginning of the 20th century. This way of thinking is still deeply rooted in some Chinese less developed areas. And I must say, as far as my research is concerned, among women, the women I studied, the Muslim women I studied, which represent the most progressive women in Linxia city, those who open modern women's madaris, and those who published a monthly journal, which was called Muslim Women, and who abide by this principle of the woman, the well-educated Muslima, who has to be educated in order to better function as a mother. So this idea of the mother and the well-educated woman within the Muslim contemporary debate is still very, very strong.
Thank you, Francesca. Netusha, if you want to say something.
Yeah, that's a great question, Elisa. Well, the thing is, like, there's like this juncture in this, there's like the past in Malaysia, feminist movements, and then there's the present, and then there's the future, right? With everything. So in terms of the past, I would say, like, studying history, it's very intersectional. And you had like a variety of different feminist movements, but all of them are very intersectional, even in its own ways. So, and this history of feminism in Malaysia is connected to the wider region culturally and socially. Malay women have always been interesting sides of feminism from outside the canon, as I would say. It's so outside the canon and so understudied to the point that there is no equivalent Malay word for feminism. People still say feminisma. In fact, I asked a very famous scholar in Indonesia on feminist theory if there is like a indigenous word for feminism or intersectional feminism, right? And it turns out no, it's still intersectional feminisma. And I'm like, why? Like, we need to, like, examine this and ask, why are we just importing rather than coming from the canon and finding a word? So one suggestion was to change intersectional to persilangan, which is a word in Malay to mean literally intersection. And somehow, this is still up to debate. And you have a lot of the feminist discourse in Malaysia is also quite divided by class. That's something that is part of the present and probably stems from the past, right? Change in economy, political economy, the role of women. I'm going to write this down in the chat later, but there's this really great book if you're interested in the early modern history of feminism in Southeast Asia. Her name is Barbara Andaya, and she wrote a book called The Flaming Womb, which is about the history of moral authority and women in Southeast Asia. And if you're interested in, like, because I don't consider myself an expert in the study of feminism in Malaysia and the history, I know very generally only. I totally recommend these two authors in the context of Malaysia. Masna Muhammad, who's a scholar in the National University of Singapore in Malay Studies, and Aiwa Ong, who is this brilliant anthropologist. And she wrote this really interesting book about the spirit of resistance, anti-capitalist resistance, by examining working class Malay women and how they protest against their poor working conditions in factories by fainting or pretending that they were possessed by ghosts and whatnot. And these are different ways feminism exists in Malaysia. It comes from, notions of whether it's motherhood and raising the next future leader. It could be in terms of protests as simple as, as Aiwa Ong mentions in the book, and in everyday life towards the patriarchy, basically. So that's the interesting thing about Malaysian, or not just Malaysian, but actually Southeast Asian feminist history, right? That it exists in multiple layers. There's also a great podcast recently called Her Story of Southeast Asia. You can find it on Twitter if you're interested to learn about feminist histories of Southeast Asia. Two scholars I can recommend from Indonesia. This scholar where I had this discussion about translating feminism, and she wrote a book called Translating Feminism. Her name is Intan Pramadita, wonderful scholar, and Haryati Sinaga. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much. I think it was very amazing discussion. So I have to thank both of you and also Annalisa and the team of ICMA. I want to invite again to our speakers to the interview that will come after the conference. Just stay tuned in the Zoom room. And I thank you everyone for having and joining us today. And as Annalisa already said, just stay tuned because we have a lot of news for you and events for you. So thank you so much and have a good day and a good weekend.